Originally, this was going to be my first video that I did on the channel, but after practicing and getting better with this type of stuff, I decided that I'd rewrite my original script and talk way more in depth about the series. Expect spoilers all throughout this, because it's kinda hard to skirt around those like in my previous videos, since this series is driven by these characters and artistic design, rather than its plot. Kiznaiver is an original anime by Studio Trigger that came out in the spring of 2016 and receded into obscurity because of how experimental, for a Trigger series, it seemed to be. It's a show that, while being wholly different to their previous works, still managed to be an over-the-top kind of anime, with this one being focused more upon the drama aspect. I feel it ultimately was overlooked by the community because, on the surface, the series looks very plain. So it was kind of expected for it to be overshadowed by other series such as Re:Zero, My Hero Academia, and JoJo, considering their premises are a lot more enticing to the viewer. The story, in its most basic form, is that scientists kidnap 6 teenagers and force them into situations where they're meant to feel several different emotions to test something that was surgically placed into them, all to gather data. These teenagers all get linked together and become able to feel the physical pain that one of them is feeling, and even their emotional pain later within the series. Past knowing that information, the rest of the series is spent basically torturing 7 kids all for the sake of science. What this anime lacks in its plot, I feel it completely makes up for with its characters. The characters are all really well written and they feel real with a lot of their dialogue and choices that they make, albeit some of them having exaggerated personalities. The anime starts off with a flashback that leads into the introduction of our main character, Katsuhira Agata. He's a monotone character who is shown as someone that doesn't understand how feelings work because he is unable to feel anything, no emotional nor physical pain. Because of this, he's prone to being bullied, which worries his childhood friend, Chidori Takashiro. After another confrontation with his usual bullies, Katsuhira is saved by Hajime Tenga. Tenga is introduced as a tough guy, always looking out for those that can't protect themselves, and because of this, he starts trying to become buddies with our emotionless main character, under the guise of asking for protection money. With that interaction out of the way, we're given a very well done scene that shows off the rest of our main cast, that leads into the introduction of the antagonist within the series. The introduction of this character is where the show really begins, since after that happens, our main characters are kidnapped by people dressed as mascots, where they get subjected to surgery. The first episode of the series, while being exposition heavy, doesn't reveal too much for the series, and doesn't act as any sort of information dump. You just learn that the city our protagonists live in is some sort of huge experiment, and that our main characters all represent one of the 7 deadly sins, all for the greater purpose of being able to make everyone in their city happy. The Kizna system, the thing that was inserted into our main characters, is what the main draw to this anime is, and with that, it brings along some of the best character dynamics you can see within a series. All of our characters are incredibly different compared to each other, and in most cases, they probably wouldn't be able to get along. In this series, the scientists take these teenagers and subject them to all sorts of environments, which causes them to get to know one another, get along, and even fall in love. This type of hyperexposure speeds up the time it'd usually take for some sort of real-world bond to form because of these bizarre situations, which, in turn, creates some interesting friendships. The really interesting part about their process of taking our protagonists is that they represent the 7 deadly sins, but the scientists believe that the sins have changed over the years, transforming the meaning of them ever so slightly. While you watch the show, you get a handle on who represents what, since the anime doesn't exactly refer to them by the real name of the sin. This view into what sin they represent also brings to light some of the insecurities that the characters have, and you get to pick up on these little things all throughout the series. This anime is almost constant character development, and that is the most interesting part about it. And it even puts in some of the well-done jokes here and there to help lighten tension, though some of the jokes might be a miss for some people. After the group gets to know one another through one of the experiments that forces them to get closer, they find out that there's a 7th member of the group. They're very surprised by this, despite them always being referred to as the 7 deadly sins, and it becomes the next experiment in the series, so to speak. This episode in particular is one of the more lighthearted episodes in the series, and it's a really fun way to introduce the final character you'll meet within it. Upon the entry of the 4th episode, the story becomes a lot lighter in terms of its content, because it starts building the characters that we've been introduced to over the past few episodes. The story is still there, but it decides to take a backseat since it wants you to truly understand the characters, who they are, and what they represent. At this point in the anime, you start to realize that this series isn't just an over-the-top drama with science fiction strewn throughout it. It starts to become more of an unorthodox romance anime. While some people may think that this is kind of sudden, there are subtle hints towards it taking that direction as early as the first episode, but those could also be seen as someone just taking interest in something pretty foreign to them. The experiments start tottering towards more positive emotions rather than negative ones through inflicting pain and fear. At this point in the series, it gets revealed that their pain wasn't the only thing that was connected, but also their emotions, which leads their experiments into a different path. Instead of simply scaring and hurting the teenagers, they want them to get closer to each other through exploiting the various deeper feelings and tragic events that went on through their lives. Through this exploitation, the main cast is able to get closer, and they start to truly understand how they realistically feel about each other. During this time, it also brings about one of the best character arcs I've seen written in the series. This particular arc builds upon Honoka Maki, and starts to give some reason behind how she acts. It shows that she has a past that she doesn't want to be revealed, and it becomes a really crucial point in the story, since it brings all of her Kiznaivers together. It's known that she had a seemingly romantic relationship and wants to forget her past because she regrets all of her actions and wishes she could have done something else, and that pain always haunts her. None of these things are outright said, but you can gather that information through how the character acts, through the context and subtleties of what happens. It's honestly amazing how this anime portrays this, and doesn't need to outright tell you anything. It's even sparked some talk based around this character arc in general because of it, albeit some of the arguments I've seen not really understanding how a person would react in these sorts of situations. It also brings about one of the best scenes in the entire series. With this, the Kiznaivers are pretty much forced into revealing their blossoming feelings for each other, despite some of them not even feeling anything for them in that way. Because of this, it leads into the big part of the plot of the series, Katsuhira and Noriko's past. By this point, it's no surprise to know that they were Kiznaivers back when they were children. This leads into some really touching scenes, and it makes you feel a lot better towards the antagonist of the series, because you learn that she's not this horrible person that the anime somewhat portrays her as. This leads the way into the ending arc. It reveals everything about the past, all the while showing how awful the organization that runs the Kizna system really is with their experiments. The ending, on the contrary to all the good seen previously, is pretty rushed and can feel like a huge letdown to someone who is enjoying the series. Despite its rushed nature, however, it feels like a perfect ending since it matches the theme of the series. In many cases, an ending like this would probably ruin everything that a series had worked up to, but it's very fitting for this particular series, which makes it stand out even more among the crowd of anime. You see, the anime's theme expresses the different kinds of relationships, from friendship to requited love. The entirety of the series revolves around the fleeting nature of emotions, and it really shows by how fast-paced everything really is. And while it's not the best to look at by a critical standpoint, it's amazing to see by a thematic one. The other themes that this series seems to express is about loss, acceptance, recovery, and letting go, which is why I think that this anime's themes were used again in Darling in the Franxx, but was expanded upon since this anime was really a flop for a trigger anime. It had a lot of interesting things to it, but since it wasn't executed as well as it could be, it couldn't really shine like they wanted it to. Kiznaiver's story is really well done, and it has a pretty good pacing to it, which makes things feel a bit weird when the pace slows down a little towards the final arc, and makes it a bit awkward considering the final episode just happens so fast. It's not perfect, but it manages to keep its story coherent the whole time, and it is quite an experience. The main cast of characters in this series, being based around the 7 deadly sins, are pretty diverse. While you can obviously tell which sins some of the Kiznaivers are supposed to represent, it's hard to tell for others until you reach the later parts of the series because of certain interactions. We'll start by talking about the ones that are glaringly obvious what sins they represent, and also talk about what else they could possibly show. Katsuhira, called the moron or imbecile, represents sloth. His mannerisms are very sluggish, down to even how he talks in his monotone way, which also alludes to him being the representation of depression caused by a tragic event. He's always seen wanting to understand how he feels and to understand how others feel, so he can set up a meaningful connection with them. Chidori is called the goody two-shoes for her sin, which is clearly envy by how she's constantly shown being jealous of Noriko, envying her since Katsuhira has taken such an interest in her. Because of this, throughout the show, she tends to be fairly annoying because of how insistent she is for wanting Katsuhira to get away from Noriko. Yoshiharu Hizomu, the immoral, is a huge masochist that doesn't really have any deeper meaning behind that. He's just the depiction of lust. Tenga, with the sin of musclehead, is the clearest representation of wrath. He always wants to look strong in front of others, but that representation also brings to light his insecurities, and helps us lead into knowing the personalities of the other characters, either through a meaningful reaction or just completely teasing them. The rest of the characters are a bit more complicated to figure out. They seem to be a bit more straightforward, but they, mostly, are categorized into their sins by their insecurities more than their surface personalities. Nico Niyama, the eccentric one, is surprisingly the personification of greed. Rather than showing the usual depiction of it, it shows that she's greedy through wanting the attention of others, and because of that, she acts with a false personality to draw people in to look at her and take an interest in her, all because of her insecurities around her being rich. She even goes out of her way to make herself look dumb in her normal school life, and gets a little distressed when the other Kiznaivers find out that she's actually pretty smart. Suguhito Yuta, on the other hand, is very normal in everything he does, but his personality makes you think that he's pride, but, in fact, he's gluttony. Him being the representation of gluttony stems from his insecurities about his childhood back when he was fat, and because of that, he's gained pretty superficial interest in pretty much every girl because of his childhood embarrassing him so severely. Lastly, we have Maki, the High and Mighty as the anime calls her, who is probably one of the better characters out of the main cast. She's very clearly the representation of pride, but it's not all that simple. Her pride sin comes from her horrible outward personality, which pushes people away, because she's afraid to let anyone come close to her because of a tragic event that happened in her past that made her dull her emotions. Her character arc shows that she's scared of showing her true feelings because she's scared of getting hurt, and it's one reason why she's never gave in to her true feelings when she was with her friend. Because of this, she ends up having no interest in anyone else. The only other character that's worthy of mentioning is Noriko Sonozaki. Throughout the series, she's shown as this really cold person with a lack of empathy towards anything, and she tends to treat our main characters like garbage. Like previously mentioned, she's the series' antagonist, but the more you watch, the more you feel like she's not that bad of a person, and it's even shown that there is some kindness behind that guise of hers because of the smaller things she does and some of her mannerisms, which makes her a pretty interesting character in general. And that's really all I can say about Kiznaiver. It's an amazing anime, and I'm glad it's one that I could call my favorite original anime series. It's a very dear series to me, since it was the first time in a long while that I could even find an anime that would make me cry. It's an anime that I feel that everyone should watch and see these unique characters, and get to grow with them. See you next time, weebs.
Your body, it belongs to us!